Welcome to We Can Be. I'm Chris DeCardi. Today's guest is an accomplished farmer, nonprofit leader, author, subject of a new documentary, and was honored with a Heinz Award for the economy in 2023 for her dedication to land and food equity. Leah Penniman is the co-founder and co-director of Soulfire Farm in Grafton, New York, as well as the author of Farming While Black, Soulfire Farm's Guide to Liberation on the Land. She is featured in the recent documentary, Farming While Black, and co-directs the nonprofit Soulfire Farm, which has reached upwards of 350,000 people with their in-person and virtual programs and trainings. With features in Forbes, Food and Wine, The Washington Post, and The New York Times, just to name a few, Leah and Soulfire Farm are making an impressive impact on the farming, food, and social justice sectors. Leah Penniman, to give our listeners some background and context, could you please read a few lines from Farming While Black?
I never imagined that I would become a farmer. In my teenage years, as my race consciousness evolved, I got the message loud and clear that Black activists were concerned with gun violence, housing discrimination, and education reform, while white folks were concerned with organic farming and environmental conservation. I felt that I had to choose between my people and the earth, that my dual loyalties were pulling me apart and negating my inherent right to belong. Fortunately, my ancestors had other plans.
I've had the chance to receive Farming While Black. I've had the chance to look through it a little bit, Leah. I have not had the chance to read it in depth yet. But one of the things I took away from the beginning of Farming While Black is you focused on land and that land matters. And I'm interested to understand your perspective about why land matters.
Well, Toni Morrison said that if there's a book you need to read that hasn't been written, go and write it. And so the motivation to write a book about Farming While Black, and specifically about Black land mattering very much, was because when I was growing up as a young farmer in the mid-90s, I went to all the conferences and read the books, and it was very rare to see someone who looked like me or reflected my heritage, especially amongst the leaders and experts. And so I quickly came to doubt whether I had made the wrong choice in being a servant of the earth and of people through farming. Fortunately, through mentors and guides, I was able to stay the course. But something that I learned throughout that process is that I wasn't alone and it wasn't an accident of history. If you look at land ownership in the United States, 95% of the agricultural land is owned by one racial group. And I'll let you guess who that is. It's certainly not African Americans, right? And so this is because of a long legacy of land dispossession, of discrimination by the USDA, of folks being driven off their land by, white supremacists for having the audacity to not want to share crop anymore, air property discrimination, and so on. And so understanding this history of dispossession was also really important in situating my work as a farmer in a context of reclamation of a heritage.
That's super interesting. And you mentioned in your intro, and I think you've touched on this, that to farm while black is, I think, two things. One is it's an act of defiance against white supremacy. And the second is to honor the agricultural integrity of our ancestors. What is your farm? What is Soulfire Farm against those two seminal points that you make?
So our farm does our level best to implement and evolve African heritage farming practices. So something that amazed me when I started doing this research is that so many of the regenerative and organic farming methods that we may take for granted as ahistorical or European have indigenous roots, and specifically Black indigenous roots. So things like raised beds, we can trace to the Ovambo people, polycultures to Nigeria, certain composting techniques to the women of Liberia, and on and on. And so it's very important to us that when our young people come to this farm and they see the plants growing in their beautiful polyculture diversity, when they see the way the soil is cover cropped, like Dr. George Washington Carver taught us, that they understand that we're not borrowing somebody else's legacy, that we're really building upon the noble contributions of our ancestors. So helping to rewrite that story in action as well as in print. And then this act of defiance against white supremacy, it would take a whole dissertation to kind of elucidate the history of Black land dispossession, but suffice to say that the reason that Black folks have about 1.5% of the farms in this country is because of a legacy of white supremacy and racism, not because of any choice or desire not to be on the land. And this is a trend of dispossession that continues to this day. Even for us, when we wanted to get land, we couldn't afford, prime land. We were denied a bank loan. We're up here on the mountain where the USDA agent laughed at us when we said we were going to start a farm on this soil type. And I'm relatively privileged. I have colorism privilege, I have education privilege, and still land by and large is passed down in the family, and our communities don't have any of it. So to be here farming not just for ourselves, but cooperatively and running an educational program and helping to grow and inspire and equip new farmers is starting to shift those trends around dispossession toward reclamation and agency.
Yeah, that's so well put. And one of the things that we know is that the pathway to intergenerational wealth transfer is through land, is through property.
Exactly.
And so it's no accident, right, that you dispossess, that you prevent that from being able to happen, because that has been the fundamental pathway to prosperity and intergenerational wealth in this nation throughout the course of our history. And I think the other thing you raise that is really interesting is that it is not because folks who are bringing forward what would be considered traditional farming practices or quaint farming practices, as if those farming practices are not effective or are not viable. That's not the issue. What you point out is that actually aspects of what we increasingly know even more and more about the best types of farming practices are the very farming practices that come from the traditional cultures that have been wiped out or ignored. The vision that you have, it sounds like, is in these two places, and to have a place to be able to make that happen. Did I summarize that all right?
Yeah, you did very well. And I think I would just add that, when we think about these traditional or indigenous farming practices, they're not frozen in history. At no point did any indigenous community say, this seed exactly how it is, we're just going to keep it that way forever. They evolve, and we continue to evolve our practices. So there can be a myth of primitivism when we talk about indigeneity, which it certainly is both modern and ancient at the same time. And the other thing that I've been fascinated by, the Rodale Institute has done some pretty courageous research on this, is that, yes, of course, when you look at industrial ag yields on a monocrop basis in a single season, they're going to outperform regenerative and organic. But as soon as you expand that time scale to 4 to 6 years, and you have an opportunity to have, a drought, a pest outbreak, some sort of extreme weather event, probably climate change related, those gains shrink. And you start to see regenerative and organic have very similar yields with all of these other benefits. Regenerative organic sequester carbon into the soil. They increase soil biodiversity. They increase below ground biomass, protect water tables, reduce air pollution, increase pollinators. And so you have all of these environmental services that are provided through regenerative ag that you can't claim for industrial. And when you make your time scale appropriate into what we're dealing with in society right now, you see that it also can feed the world mathematically.
The shout out to the Rodale Institute. I had the privilege of working with them, almost 35 years ago for
Amazing.
A couple of years. So in an answer you just gave a minute ago, you referenced your journey in starting a farm. So I don't know how anybody decides they're going to go do this, which is, I'm going to go start a farm. You're a young parent. You decide to move from urban New York and to do this. Talk about why, and then talk about the journey. How did you experience some of what you're talking about, those headwinds as you tried to establish this farm?
Well, farming was my first career. It was my first job as a teenager, working for the Food Project in Boston, Mass, and later for the Farm School, Western Mass, and then Many Hands Organic Farm. I apprenticed there and moved kind of up the ranks and worked there for about 4 years, ran an urban farming program with my then partner, now spouse, called Youth Grow. It wasn't a story of fantastical imaginings. I knew what farming was. I had, almost a decade under my belt before we started Soulfire. But yes, indeed, we did have young kids. We were living in Albany, New York, in the South End, which is a neighborhood under food apartheid. So there was no supermarket or farmer's market or fresh food access. And our neighbors were similarly struggling to get fresh food to feed their own families and started to kind of half jokingly pressure us to start a farm. That had been an idea in the back of our minds already. I was also simultaneously a public school teacher. My spouse was running a building business. But we said, let's start looking around and see if there might be some land outside of Albany. This seems like a community that makes a lot of sense to serve and to continue to be involved with. And we took one step on this kind of raggedy piece of mountainside land, and like tendrils of belonging just grabbed our ankles. We were like, let's go. And thank goodness we were in our early 20s with all of that enthusiastic naivete of like, we'll just take this completely unimproved property and turn it into a farm. So, everything here was built by hand. The driveway, the septic, the electric, the road, the house, the barn was built. It's a straw bale timber frame, passive solar, all locally sourced and recycled materials. We had to build the soil from almost nothing, plant the fruit trees, fence the acreage, keep the deer out, like all the things, I think if I started now, I would not have the steam for that. But with just kids in tow, I have all these pictures of our little toddlers, like naked, putting pegs into the timber frame and doing their part. So yeah, it started out, our very first program when we finally opened in 2010, 4 years after we purchased the land, was to feed our neighbors in the South End. And then, obviously it grew and changed from there.
All you just talked about to get started is like the beginning of your mission. What part of that journey was transformative for you? What did you learn? What became more important to you about what you have since put together into this book?
There was so much to learn, much of it through trial and error. But I would say something that in those early years that really struck me is I had bought into the mythology that Black and brown folks were not interested in ecology, the environment, land, farming, for various reasons. But one of the stories that had been told is, because of the trauma of slavery, folks don't want to get dirty, they don't want to stoop, they don't want, and so I had readied myself to just be out here pretty alone, bringing food into town. I'm an introvert, I don't mind. And then, maybe doing some field trips. And so the thing that was surprising and illuminating for me was how quickly, I think it was just our second season when we started getting inquiries about apprenticeships and training programs, and folks in Albany and Troy, parents wanting to send their children out to learn how to farm and to have a place in nature. And so there was a whole reorientation that eventually caused us to start a 501c3 nonprofit. Originally we were a family farm, sole proprietorship, and our educational programming grew so much that we created an entity for that, hired staff, and, grew to what we are now today, which is by and large almost exclusively an educational organization and advocacy organization.
As a young adult, I spent months studying agriculture in Ghana, West Africa, one of my ancestral homelands. My mentors were the Queen Mothers of Manya Krobo, guardians of culture, history, and land. They asked me one day, is it true that in the United States, most farmers put a seed in the ground and they don't pray or sing or pour libations or dance or even say thank you to the seed, and they expect it to grow and feed them? When I ashamedly admitted to the truth of this, they said, well, no wonder you're all sick. You treat the earth as a thing and not as a living relative. You see, the seed and all that it stood for was so precious to our ancestral grandmothers in West Africa that they braided seeds of black rice into their hair while trapped in the bowels of transatlantic slave ships. They hid away the okra, molokia, Levant cotton, sesame, and black-eyed peas that they had saved for generations. They believed that their descendants would exist and that we would inherit the gift and honor the gift of the seed. While our 400-plus years immersion in racial capitalism has attempted to squash that connection to the sacred earth, there were those who persisted in believing that the land and waters are family members and who acted accordingly. As we all work together to uproot racism and seed sovereignty in the food system, we pray that the words of our mouths, the meditation of our hearts, and the work of our hands be acceptable to our grandmothers who passed us these sacred seeds. Ashe.
So we're on 80 acres. We actively cultivate between 7 and 10 acres a year. Our west field is bursting forth with all kinds of medicinal herbs and small fruits like raspberries, blueberries, strawberries. And then our east field is bursting with our vegetable crops. We grow over 100 varieties of vegetables, including a lot of African heritage and other culturally significant crops. We've got 4 high tunnels that have our hot season and seed keeping varieties. And then there's a 4-acre apple orchard that's a silvopasture. So there's goats and chickens being rotated through the apple orchard to eat the grass and turn it into, black gold out the other end. So in the woods, there's mushrooms, honeybees on the edge, and a lot of edibles that we cultivate in the forest floor. So all told, here you could enjoy many colors and smells and textures, and we've got it to be quite productive investing in this land since 2006.
The land that you are on was land long before you got there. What about its history informed part of your mission?
Yeah, so land holds many stories. The human history of this land starts, as far as we know, with the Mohican people and also to some extent the Mohawk of the Haudenosaunee and the Schaghticoke nations. There are many sacred sites. There are sacred mounds of stone throughout the forest. And over time, we've built a close relationship of friendship with many members of the Mohican Council and cultural institutions. So we've been involved in a 250-acre land back regift to the Mohican Nation. We do a seed keeping exchange, as well as some advocacy around protection of their lands and artifacts here. And so that's become very central to our work, is this solidarity with the original people. I think also, as far as human history, this region has been home to many sundown towns. And sundown towns are places during the Jim Crow era where if a Black person of color was seen after sundown, it was considered socially acceptable to shoot them dead. The fact that there are so few people of color in these towns, it's funny, you can look at the census and you can literally count. Like, I know it's less than 10. I know each one. I'm like, oh, that one Asian, that's my Buddhist monk friend down the road. And then the 2 Black people. So, and that's, again, not an accident of history. Like, people were driven out of town. And so to reclaim, as Harriet Tubman did, as the Timbuktu community did, to reclaim that Black and brown folks belong in rural spaces in the North. Like, we can be here and we can be safe here and belong and be part of governance is huge in our mission too. So in addition to the C3, we have a housing cooperative where we're actively working to make affordable housing for families of color who want to live rurally.
So that's a great segue back to that extended mission. You touched on this, but go a bit deeper. At what point did you realize that you needed to or wanted to, there was this possibility of a nonprofit organization that had this education-driven connection component for an introvert that was thinking they were going to go produce some food and deliver it?
It was community request. It was a sense of duty and obligation to tikkun olam, to heal and repair the world in response to what the community was asking of us. So our philosophy has always been, if it's in our capacity and our skill set and it's what our community needs, then we're going to try our best. And so when parents say, can you take my kid for the summer and help them get on track? Then yes, when someone says, I want to learn how to farm and I can't find any place that's culturally safe or affordable, can I come and learn with you? Then yes. And so all of our programs developed, from the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust, which we had started and incubated, it's now its own organization, to the Braiding Seeds Fellowship, to our bilingual Spanish programs. Every single one of those evolved from a community member or group asking us. And as that grew, we kind of had this moment where you go, wait a minute, we're doing all this educational programming. We're very committed that folks don't have to pay more than they can afford. And so often what they can pay is zero. And we need a staff. We need a staff. And so it just was the practical solution to run these programs, is to be able to, have grants and donations and a budget. Because up until 2016, we were entirely all volunteer. I was supplementing the operations with my teaching salary. I was a teacher, high school teacher till 2019, and my spouse was running his building company, also subsidizing, the educational programming until It was like 2014.
It's exhausting to think about that while raising a young family, getting your own income to supplement your passion, then turning that passion into something broader. You've reached now hundreds of thousands of people in person, virtual programming. I think somewhere you wrote that one of the most impactful programs is Afro-Indigenous Farming Immersion. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit more about that program and why that feels that way for you.
Oh, we love our immersion programs. We now call them FIRE, Farming in Relationship with Earth. So the Soul Fire Immersion. And we bring folks in from all over the country, oftentimes multiple countries. And it's a week of getting down and dirty with how to farm, everything from seed to harvest, as well as business planning and soil chemistry and all of those, quote unquote, hard skills related to an introduction to farming, complemented with cultural history, joyful reflection and healing, cooking together, camping out in the East Field, staying up late over a campfire. And so when folks leave this 50-hour training program, they can certainly grow a big, beautiful garden, right? But then they also have the seed skills to be able to get an apprenticeship on a farm and to advance in that direction if they would like, or to just complement their food justice advocacy work with a felt experience of what it is to be on the land. And we support our alumni forever, so there's funding opportunities and land linking opportunities. We help them to find mentors, to advocate for their projects. And so it's become this very happy family, as we say, of folks all across the hemisphere who are mutually supporting one another in this vision of food sovereignty.
Man, that might have been just like the best marketing pitch I've ever heard. I could transform myself there and want to be part of it.
Just think of adult summer camp skill building. It's really fun.
Gosh. Oh my gosh. In our podcast, we have a practice of having a special guest questioner. And I think the question we have for you is beautiful for this moment.
Hi, Lee. This is Abdul Kadir Chirambo, the Executive Director of Wanakuche Farm. We are a volunteer-run Somali Bantu-led farm in Western Pennsylvania that built on the principles of community unification, self-sufficient, and integration while upholding cultural heritage. You are doing work at Soul Fire Farm that's closely related to our work here in Pennsylvania. My question for you is, a central part of the education and advocacy component of Soul Fire Farm's programming focus on Black and Indigenous people's deep historical connections to land and food. How does it feel to see those who take part in your programs begin to reclaim that agency?
Well, first, I want to shout out the Somali Bantu farmers and thank you for all the work you do and for this beautiful question. It is really hard to describe the feeling of folks reclaiming agency around their relationship to food and land. I remember in our very first fire immersions back in, 2012, hearing folks at the closing circle say things like, "My cup is overflowing. I'm no longer going to settle for a life that's less than what I'm worthy of." To say that I now understand that I'm connected to a countless number of ancestors who've had a beautiful, noble relationship to Earth, and that I'm part of that legacy. I remember just sobbing, while everyone was sharing these reflections, because I really thought, I was like, I just taught y'all about soil chemistry and, cover cropping, and to see this level of transformation and healing made me understand that, and this is a bit philosophical, but it made me understand that the earth is eager to compost our trauma and give us hope, and that there's no substitute for that direct contact with the soil, with the plants, with the moths and butterflies. That direct contact is what allows the deeper levels of healing of not just the difficulties we've experienced in our own life, but that whole legacy of ancestral trauma that we carry in our DNA that needs to be healed and soothed and reoriented if we're going to be able to move forward in our lives with dignity and sovereignty.
That was so beautifully put, the image of the earth and earth systems and composting trauma And then the regenerative aspect of what that allows to happen is so vivid. You can hear it in your voice how much that has brought back to you. With that rootedness and that feeling and that connection, you have entered more and more into a national level policy advocacy world that often runs over that kind of stuff. What led you to decide to move in that direction, to testify in Capitol Hill, to advise members of Congress? What has that journey been like for you, and why did you decide to do it?
Well, I have the same answer for that. It's really duty calls. It wasn't something that we sought out. But, for example, to speak specifically to the Justice for Black Farmers Act, when Elizabeth Warren was a presidential candidate, she put out a policy platform on agriculture that didn't once mention farmers of color or the plight of Black farmers or farm workers. And so a bunch of us wrote a letter, that said, hey, what about us? And to her credit, she invited us into a focus group. And I was elected by a community of Black farmers to be someone in the focus group. And then that turned into this idea about legislation, right? And so if the community is asking me to do something and I can be of service and it's within my capacity, I'm going to do it. We have never chased after the spotlight or the platform, and we do our best to democratize and share our platform with our alumni and partners, and are also really seeing how important it is for those of us who have our hands in the earth and also have a systems analysis to be able to speak in the halls of power about the importance of supporting the earth and the people who care for the earth.
You are so deeply connected to the land and your mission and the connection to people. What for you are one or two major priorities that you believe, if there was legislation or administratively in Washington or in state capitals, would actually be able to provide the type of support and help to expand efforts, programs, farms like yours?
The Farm Bill is a monstrous piece of legislation. There's so much in there that really controls the food system. And right now, the bulk of the agricultural allotment supports commodity crops, which do a lot of damage to the earth and to our health as human beings. And there's really just a pittance that goes toward what they call specialty crops, fruits and vegetables and herbs. So programs like the Conservation Reserve Program, the EQIP program, these environmental incentive programs could be a lot bigger, and they could also prioritize making it less bureaucratic and cumbersome to apply, and making sure that Black and brown farmers, Indigenous farmers, women farmers are able to access these funds. And so that's a pretty simple change because those programs already exist. A more radical change is we really need to look at this land distribution issue. In this country, as I mentioned, 95% of the agricultural land is white owned, and it's very difficult to afford and hold on to real estate. Medicaid land grabs, there's all kinds of reasons why it's hard. And so the Justice for Black Farmers Act did have a provision that made it affordable to purchase land, and then for farmers of color who were able to farm the land successfully for a certain number of years to work off the debt on the land in that way. And so I would like to see land reform programs that look at equitable distribution amongst different communities.
Yeah, both of those make sense. And I think in passing, you mentioned the connection to Medicaid. Go one step deeper. What is that issue with Medicaid and property?
So my understanding of the Medicaid issue is that Medicaid is, in all practicality, a loan. And so if an elder has been using Medicaid, say, to pay for a nursing home or care at the end of life, and haven't made arrangements ahead of time to transfer their assets to their family members, and this is very common in the Black community, where I think, over half of folks don't leave wills and certainly don't have these financial advisors to say, make sure you give your property to your kids 10 years ahead. So when they die, much to the surprise of the family who may be living on that land and farming on that land, Medicaid can seize the home and the assets related to the home. So we have had a significant amount of dispossession of Black land through this mechanism.
Yeah, so it's an example of how institutions are structured for those who know how to navigate through institutions.
Exactly.
And perpetuate an issue that you just raised, was the overwhelming percentage of farming land that is owned by people who are white. So you talk in your book about a lot of influences for you, and you've mentioned a couple of those. But another thing that you do in the book is you include a series of what you call uplift features. And I wonder what you're doing with that and why you call them uplift. And maybe give an example or one or two that feel really important to you.
So the uplift sections in Farming While Black are an attempt to connect regenerative agricultural practices to African agrarian wisdom. For example, when we compost, we might not always think about where that technology originated. And yet there's a beautiful African dark earth composting method that was created by the women of Liberia and Ghana over hundreds and hundreds of years that makes this super rich, fertile compost. And so to make sure that we include them when we talk about how great it is to compost, right? When I was just in the high tunnels a couple of days ago, scattering cover crop seed to deal with a nematode problem and get a little more nitrogen into the soil. And so when I cover crop, I think about, and I want other people to think about, Dr. George Washington Carver, who in the late 1800s and early 1900s was advocating for cover cropping and crop rotation and polycultures at a time when this was not being talked about, and so he can be considered one of the grandfathers of the modern regenerative movement. And so these uplift sections, and there are, of course, dozens more, are an attempt to put Black people back into the story of agriculture beyond the usual limited narrative of chattel slavery.
Well, uplift is a wonderful way to conclude our time together. The name of our podcast, Leah, is We Can Be. What do you believe we can be?
I believe that we can be a world of compassionate, nonviolent, and caring beings.
Thank you, Leah. And for those of you who may be wondering how long Leah's passion for equity has been at her core, we're going to close out this episode with a few wonderfully inspiring lines from Leah's 1998 high school graduation speech.
What do we live for? Who are our heroes? What are our goals? We can't afford to be content or to close our eyes anymore. We are a family of the same blood, sharing the same fragile home. And we have to begin living as if we believe this. Every dollar that you spend is a vote. Every word that you speak is a prayer. And every action that you take has an effect on the global village. Live as if each human being is your brother or sister, and every piece of earth is your home. Fight evil with love and apathy with hope. Anne Frank said, "How wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world." Thank you.